Hey everybody, this video is called The Prescription of the Animals, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here of the Book of Leviticus, looking at chapter 11, where we're going to look at what are clean animals and what are unclean animals in regards to consumption. So let's look at Leviticus chapter 11, verse 1 through 8, starting out. It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, These are the animals which you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Among the animals, whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves and chewing the cud, that you may eat. Nevertheless, these you shall not eat among those that chew the cud, or those that have cloven hooves. The camel, because it chews the cud, but it does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. The rock hyrax, because it chews the cud and it does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. The hare, because it chews the cud but it does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. And the swine, though it divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, yet does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. Their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean to you." So, from this point on through chapter 16, we're going to see instructions of what's clean and what's unclean being covered. And it focuses on what is holy and what is unholy, and what's acceptable to God, what's not acceptable to God. And we look at legislation on the consumption of animals here. And you're going to notice that God didn't give any reasons for the prohibitions that are listed here. But the Israelites must obey God's absolute standard regardless of the reasoning. And the unique diet would make it difficult for Israel to eat with other cultures that were idolatrous people around and that were among them. And yes, there were dietary and hygienic benefits, but ultimately this was for the divine, for the purpose of obedience and separation from those of the world. And we see right off that the laws speaking about eating mammals, and if an animal had a divided hoof and it chewed its cud, but it didn't have divided hooves but had paws, it was unclean and it was considered not kosher. And that would be the animals such as camels and the rock hyrax, and the very common one most people already know is pigs are considered unclean. And they couldn't even touch these types of animals. And keep in mind that this was not new to Israel. These rules were already in place back with Noah in Genesis chapter 7 verse 2, in Genesis chapter 8 verse 20. And they practiced the clean and unclean traditions before the Levitical law here. In verse 9 through 12 it says, "These you may eat of all that are in the water. Whatever in the water has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, that you may eat. But in all the seas or in the rivers that do not have fins and scales, all that move in the water, or any living thing which is in the water, they are an abomination to you. They shall be an abomination to you. You shall not eat their flesh, but you shall regard their carcasses as an abomination. Whatever in the water does not have fins or scales, that shall be an abomination to you." So much like hoof characteristics in cud, the fins and the having no fins and scales guidelines, they ruled out a segment of water life that was commonly consumed by different cultures of ancient people. And any water creature that had fins and scales was edible, and it was considered kosher for the Israelites. And the fish that would be unclean would be the fish like that some people consume today. Like down south, catfish is huge, as they have no scales. And shellfish, and what's interesting is you look at shellfish, and there's many people that have allergies to them. But shellfish such as clams and crabs and oysters and lobsters, they don't have fins, they don't have scales. And I'm very obedient in this area because I'm not a big fan of seafood. I like haddock. But I see these foods listed. New Year's Eve is coming up. So if you believe in the dietary laws still apply to you, then you can't be partaking in that next month or, next month for New Year's. In verses 13 through 19 here, it says, "And these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination: the eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the kite, and the falcon after its kind, every raven after its kind, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, the seagull, and the hawk after its kind, the little owl, and the fisher owl, and the screech owl, the white owl, and the jackdaw, and the carrion vulture, the stork, the heron after its kind, the hoopoe, and the bat." So rather than by different characteristics and descriptions, the birds are named here simply. And there are about 20 that are all listed right here, but most of them listed here, what they all got in common is they are predators and scavengers. And we would not have COVID-19 today if people didn't eat bats. And that's just a joke that I'm throwing out there. If you remember when COVID-19 first came out, it was believed that certain people were eating bats, and that's how it came across. So stay calm. I don't really believe it's a bat issue. But verse 20 through 23 says, "All flying insects that creep on all fours shall be an abomination to you. Yet these you may eat of every flying insect that creeps on all fours, those which have jointed legs above their feet with which to leap on the earth. These you may eat: the locust after its kind, the destroying locust after its kind, the cricket after its kind, and the grasshopper after its kind. But all other flying insects which have 4 feet shall be an abomination to you." So any crawling insect was considered not kosher, such as ants, and flying insects needed to have legs jointed above their feet, such as locusts and crickets and grasshoppers. And in verse 21, it describes the locusts here. In verse 24 through 28, it says, "By these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them shall be unclean until evening. Whoever carries part of the carcass of any of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. The carcass of any animal which divides the foot, but is not cloven hooved, or does not chew its cud, is unclean to you. Everyone who touches it shall be unclean. And whatever goes on its paws, among all kinds of animals that go on all fours, those are unclean to you. Whoever touches any such carcass shall be unclean until evening. And whoever carries any such carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. It is unclean to you." So here through verse 43, it deals with the separation from other defiling things. And unclean dead animals couldn't stay rotten in the community. They were to be brought out of the community and disposed. And those who disposed the unclean animals, they had to wash and they had to quarantine until evening. And this would prevent diseases from coming about and spreading, such as the bubonic plague that happened many years ago, right around the year 1350, that took out a quarter of Europe's population. And Jewish communities didn't have that impact as they followed these regulations. So even though these are kosher, these are not kosher, even though it might seem harsh to you, especially with the American diet, we see that they had their purpose, that the Jewish communities did not see the impact of the bubonic plague like Europe saw. And they were accused, though, at this time of being the mastermind behind the plague. And that's where washing your hands in quarantine came about. If you across someone that was carrying a disease like we have seen with COVID. And, when you remember COVID first came out and about, it was like starting to be preached to wash your hands and to keep your distance from people. And, if you came across somebody with COVID, stay your distance away from them and all that. So these are biblical practices that were around even in the Bible times. But the prohibited animals in verses 26 and 27, we need to think of what you might find here in America, like horses and donkeys and lions. Well, you won't see lions around here except at the zoo. But, in countries where you have lions and tigers, they were prohibited animals in verses 26, 27. In verse 29 through 30, it says, "These also shall be unclean to you among the creeping things that creep on the earth, the mole, the mouse, and the large lizard after its kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand reptile, the sand lizard, and the chameleon." So here are more unclean animals here that creep and that are reptiles. And if you don't know what geckos are, if you live in Hawaii, you absolutely know what geckos are because they're all around you there. And my cat used to love these lizards. Geckos are pretty much lizards. Think of them that way. My cat loved them, and my cat thought they were a delicious snack. So my cat is a sinner and does not eat kosher. In verse 31 through 38, it says, "These are unclean to you among all that creep. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until evening. Anything on which any of them falls when they are dead shall be unclean, whether it is any item of wood or clothing or skin or sack. Whatever item it is in which any work is done, it must be put in water. And it shall be unclean until evening, then it shall be clean. Any earthen vessel into which any of them falls you shall break, and whatever it is in it shall be unclean. In such a vessel any edible food upon which water falls becomes unclean, and any drink that may be drunk from it becomes unclean. And everything on which a part of any such carcass falls shall be unclean. Whether it is in the oven or cooking stove, it shall be broken down, for they are unclean, and they shall be unclean to you. Nevertheless, a spring or a cistern, I believe it's cistern, in which there is plenty of water shall be clean, but whatever touches any such carcass becomes unclean. And if a part of such carcass falls on any plant and seed, which is to be sown, it remains clean. But if water is put on the seed, and if a part of any such carcass falls on it, it shall become unclean to you. So these laws are very much focused on hygienics. And if a rodent crawled into a bowl, that bowl would be considered contaminated with possibly a disease. And to pass to anyone using the bowl, that bowl was to be broken to prevent the spread of diseases. And these laws, they promoted cleanliness in the Hebrews' homes, that promoted the health and welfare to the family. In verse 39 through 40, it says, "And if any animal which you may eat dies, he who touches its carcass shall be unclean until evening. He who eats its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. He also who carries its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening." So these laws applied to the natural death of clean animals, and this was not the butchering for food or death by sacrifice. And once again, these handling carcasses were ceremonially uncleaned, and then they had to be cleansed by getting washed and then going into quarantine until evening. Verse 41 through 43 says, "And every creeping thing that creeps on the earth shall be an abomination. It shall not be eaten. Whatever crawls on its belly, whatever goes on all fours, or whatever has many feet among all creeping things that creep on the earth, these you shall not eat, for they are an abomination. You shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creeps, nor shall you make yourselves unclean with them, lest you be defiled by them." So once again, creeping animals were considered not kosher, they were unclean. In verse 44 through 47, the rest of the verses here, says, "For I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore consecrate yourselves," meaning set yourselves apart, "and you shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth. For I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." This is the law of the animals and the birds and every living creature that moves in the waters, and of every creature that creeps on the earth, to distinguish between the unclean and the clean, and between the animal that may be eaten and the animal that may not be eaten. So we can learn that God is sovereign over us and can tell us what we can eat and what we can't eat. And God is sovereign over us. He can tell us what is healthy, what is not. And He knows what's best for His people. And one great purpose to the dietary law for Israel was to sanctify them, to set them apart from the world of the other nations. And we see later on in the Bible, in Daniel chapter 1, you see the sanction in effect as Daniel and his friends they refused to eat the unkosher food that was offered by the Babylonian king at the table. And then God goes on to bless the Daniel and his friends. And there were essentially three categories for unclean animals, such as predators and scavengers and potentially poisonous and dangerous foods. And what you also got to keep in mind when you look at the Levitical law of dietary, as we went through, they didn't have, stovetops and all that we have today. Today we know to measure food temperatures. If I cook chicken, I know I have to cook it to, I think it's 165 or whatever. My wife makes my food for me because I'd probably undercook something and kill myself. But we're not going to make fun of me that I can't cook. But these food laws, they protected Israel from many different diseases. And even 1,350 years after Christ, when the bubonic plague came along, the Jewish people were still practicing these laws, and they were protected, unlike Europe, as I mentioned, that had a 25% fatality rate to the bubonic plague. So, to wrap up here, we looked at the laws that regard eating the animals of the land, the water, the air. And we looked at the disposal of carcasses of the unclean animals, including things such as different types of reptiles and creeping things. And we looked at the transmission of uncleanness from unclean animals. And we look at the carcasses of clean animals. We see how creeping animals are considered unclean. And we see what the purpose is behind the dietary laws. God didn't want to just be, that strict father that makes no sense behind things. I mean, He didn't tell them straight up that He was protecting them from these different avenues, but we know later on now that these are the exact things that God was protecting His people from. And so the question here is, what do we do with Leviticus chapter 11? Does that apply to us as New Testament believers today? Are we under obligation to observe the dietary kosher diet today? And I'm not going to judge you if you want to practice the kosher diet as we see throughout the 11th chapter here. And, good for you. It's healthy. It's healthy to go off what we just read, to not eat those things. We know that pig is very unhealthy for us, whether you're eating ham, bacon, pork, whatever. It's unhealthy. But I want to look at Mark chapter 7, verse 19. So we're going to answer a question here. Does this affect us as New Testament believers? Should we be following the same diet? So Mark chapter 7, verse 19. And we'll start before that. Let's go with 18 and 19. We'll go through 23, never mind. So 18, Mark chapter 7, verse 18 through 23. It says, "So he said to them, Are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him? Because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods?" ? And he said, "Whatever comes out of a man that defiles a man, for from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile a man." So Jesus in this passage is declaring all foods clean. And I want to go over to Acts chapter 10. So Acts chapter 10, start at verse 9 through 16. It says, "The next day, as they went out on the journey and drew near the city, Peter went up to the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. Then he became very hungry and wanted to eat. But while they were made ready, he fell into a trance and saw heaven open, and an object like a great sheet, bound at the four corners, descending to him and let down from the earth. In it were all kinds of four-footed animals of the earth, wild beasts, creeping things, and birds of the air. And a voice came to him, 'Rise, Peter, kill and eat.' But Peter said, 'Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean.' And a voice spoke to him again the second time, saying, 'What God has cleansed, you must not call common.' This was done 3 times, and the object was taken up into heaven again." So we see here that God has given Peter a vision that implied formerly unclean animals now could be eaten. And when Jesus died on the cross, he didn't abolish the law, but Jesus fulfilled the law. He fulfilled the Old Testament law, as Galatians 3:24 through 26 tells us. And I want to go over to one more passage here, and let's see what Timothy has to say. So 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 5 says, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidden to marry, and commanding to abstain from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth." So Timothy's speaking of a great apostasy, those who are going to depart from sound faith. And we see in verse 3 that some of the false leaders, they're going to say, that, you have to go by strict dietary laws, or else you can't go to heaven. You're going to lose your salvation if you eat that, if you don't eat clean things. Verse 4, "For every creature of God is good, and nothing is to be refused. It is received with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified by the word of God in prayer." So Paul points out that we have full liberty to eat whatever we want to. So with that being said, you want to have a cheeseburger this week, you want to have a bacon cheeseburger, go right ahead. However, if it's a stumbling block to you that you feel that you should observe the kosher dietary of Leviticus 11, then you better follow the dietary of Leviticus chapter 11. So it's based off your personal convictions, but I'm not going to condemn you if you decide to eat kosher or if you decide to not eat kosher according to the Jewish traditions. So that's a wrap up for this video. I hope it was a blessing, that you got something out of it. Leviticus is a very interesting book when we look at the laws and we see how weak we are. So I guarantee you, some of y'all, you can't even go without a lobster for a year. And my wife loves lobster. I hate lobster. She can have mine. But that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you have a great rest of your night. We'll see you whenever I do the next video. We're going to be looking at childbirth and what is unclean involving childbirth. So it's going to be a very interesting video. Leviticus is, like I said, many great topics that will draw attention. So have a great rest of your night. God bless.